Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the second week of our three-part online discussion series that is based around the theme teaching and learning about the Holocaust in the UK. If you were trying to make sense of the hashtag on Twitter, TLHUK, that's what it stands for. My name is Alex Maws. I'm the head of educational grants and projects at the Association of Jewish Refugees, or the AJR. I'm also here in my capacity as a member of the UK's delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IRA. Lots of acronyms and initials today. I've been a member of the education working group of the IRA for about the past 10 years. And it's under the auspices of the UK's IRA delegation that we're holding this series of this symposium on the topic of teaching and learning about the Holocaust in the UK, because we are helping to formally launch here in the UK a newly published set of recommendations published by the IRA on teaching and learning about the Holocaust. I'll talk a bit more about that in just a minute. Just briefly to get a few housekeeping details out of the way. The format of this is that it will be an informal discussion amongst me and four of my esteemed colleagues from across the education and remembrance sector in the UK. We'll have a free-flowing discussion, I hope, and ideally have some time for some questions from you. You can either submit them to me directly in the chat function. Again, my name is Alex Maws, and you'll see my name there as the host of the event, and then I can relay them to our panelists. If you want to share your thoughts with other people as well, last week there was a nice discussion going on Twitter using the hashtag TLHUK, and you can tag the AJR _ as well. It's a good way to find other people who are also on this event. As I mentioned, everyone is muted. We'll keep you muted throughout this just to reduce all the background noise and things like that. And questions will be taken just through the chat function. For security reasons, we've also disabled some of the normal Zoom functions that you might be accustomed to using. So that anything that you find that you're normally able to do that you're not able to do here, it's just to prevent any unwanted intrusions, which apparently is a thing these days. I want to just mention that several of my colleagues from the AJR are with us today, in particular Carol Hart and Michael Newman, who are on hand as co-hosts. If you have any questions or anything, you can direct them to them in the chat as well. Just to mention that we are recording this event through Zoom. The easiest way, if you don't want to be on a recording that will be going on YouTube afterwards, is just to switch off your camera. You can still be part of the event, but not be seen on the video. Just to share my screen very briefly, wanted to. Sorry, there we go. Just say here is as I mentioned, the hashtag that you can use if you're on Twitter. And just to say a brief word about the Association of Jewish Refugees, we are a UK-based charity that supports Jewish refugees from Nazism and Holocaust survivors living in the UK with a range of social welfare programs. And on behalf of our members, we also have an educational program under which I think events like this logically sit. And we mainly fund a range of educational projects and initiatives across the UK in keeping with the wishes of our members who want to ensure that their legacy is preserved for future generations. We also have a archive of more than 250 recorded video testimonies from refugees and survivors called Refugee Voices, which you can find on the website ajrrefugeevoices.org.uk. wanted to, as I mentioned before, the occasion for us being here today is the launch of this publication. Normally I would hold it up for you, but of course my copy of it is in my office, which I haven't been to in several months. So here's what it looks like. You can download the IRA publication, Recommendations for Teaching and Learning About the Holocaust, on the IRA website, which is holocaustremembrance.com. And you can also find IRA on Twitter at the IRA. So there is a little bit of background for what brings us here today. Those who were with us last week, and actually we have, I think, more people here this week than last week, which is quite impressive. So I don't want to repeat everything that we said. Last week, I mentioned in setting up the event that one of the points in the aims section of that publication of Teaching and Learning About the Holocaust says, these recommendations contribute to an ongoing conversation between academics, policymakers, practitioners, and wider society about the relevance and importance of teaching and learning about the Holocaust today. And that's really the spirit in which we're hosting this conversation. We want to expand what is discussed in terms of the actual guidance in those recommendations, just hear about how that plays out in practice and some of the other questions that it logically leads to in the UK context. Those who didn't attend last week's or view last week's event, you can find it on the AJR's YouTube channel. This week we're going to consider where else teaching and learning takes place. We're going to look at the role played by museums, memorials, and archives. We have with us representatives from the Imperial War Museums, the National Holocaust Center and Museum, the Wiener Holocaust Library, the UK Holocaust Memorial Foundation. And that's just the people that we thought we could squeeze into an hour-long conversation. It's worth noting the many institutions in the UK who aren't on this panel, but very well could form a week two of this same discussion. The Holocaust Exhibition and Learning Center at the University of Huddersfield. I've seen a few of our colleagues from there here on the call. The Jewish Museum London, which has an excellent Holocaust exhibition and learning program. The Jewish Museum in Manchester, same thing. The Scottish Jewish Archive Center, currently developing a Holocaust resource center. The Lake District Holocaust Project, which is in Windermere, and probably a few others that I'm forgetting. So today I'm hoping that we will learn more about how experts from several leading institutions see their role in contributing to teaching and learning about the Holocaust, but also to widen the conversation, to talk about maybe why the UK has quite so many Holocaust-related centers, and how do these centers and institutions individually and collectively contribute to our country's collective memory. It's worth mentioning at the outset the proverbial elephant in the room, that being coronavirus, of course. Most of the institutions that we're hearing from today have had to very much rethink what it is that they do over the past few months. If you are a museum, for example, what are you if you're not a place that people visit? It might be interesting to hear a little bit about how they have adapted to these circumstances, but I also want to mainly focus on their normal work under the assumption that eventually we will all get back to that sort of work, and the work that they have been developing over many years will continue for many years to come. We have guests on our panel from a diverse range of institutions and also a diverse range of roles within those institutions. So let me welcome our panelists. So we have with us Rachel Donnelly, who is formerly the Holocaust Learning Manager and currently the project manager for the Second World War and Holocaust Partnership Program at the Imperial War Museums. Louise Stafford is the Director of Learning at the National Holocaust Center Museum, I should say. Barbara Warnock is the Senior Curator for Exhibitions and Education at the Wiener Holocaust Library. And Martin Winstone is the Project Historian for the UK Holocaust Memorial, which is under development right now, or planning right now. And also, it's worth noting, given that we're talking about the role of sites and places and memorials, he's the author of the Holocaust Sites of Europe, which isn't exactly why he was invited to this panel, but I can't help but wonder if that background might might play into our discussion as well. So welcome to all of our guests. Now, I've unmuted each of you, and I hope that you have then gone and unmuted yourselves. It looks like you should be able to be heard, so we're gonna hope for the best here. And I wanted to start by really just giving you a minute or two each, just to give our audience a bit of background about your institution for those who aren't familiar with them. Maybe, you know, tell us what it is that you normally do in non-coronavirus times, and maybe a couple of specifics about a project or a program that you're particularly excited about right now, maybe excited about getting back to once lockdown is properly over. Louise, are you happy to go first then?
Yeah.
Excellent.
To be part of this, it was really interesting last week. Can I just check that you can hear me first?
We can.
Yeah, fantastic, brilliant. Okay, so as Alex said, I am Director of Learning at the National Holocaust Centre and Museum. We're located in Nottinghamshire, and it's lovely to see some of the survivors who obviously come and work with us at the centre. I'm digitally next to Eva, so it's lovely to see you on the call. And we welcome around 18,000 primary students and 18,000 secondary students to us each year, on site and through our outreach programme, which was supported through AJR, so again, thank you. And as an organisation, we focus particularly on contemporary questions raised through the Holocaust, and specifically the role of upstanders and raising those questions with students and other audiences. We are really deliberately taking a creative, engaging, and really audience-focused approach, and that can be quite challenging at times, but I think it's something that is really important. We are a national portfolio organisation, so we work really closely with the Arts Council, and that feeds into that creative aspect of our work. In terms of some of the key programmes that we're looking at the moment, it's a really big week for us this week. We are in the middle of launching our Journey app. So on site, for those of you who've been to visit the centre, you know that we have two permanent exhibitions. The Journey exhibition, which is aimed at older primary children, and that immersive hands-on exhibition we have spent the last 3 years translating into an app which can be shared universally, and we've got a few events taking place this week to mark that launch. And we're also really interested in creative storytelling, so probably a lot of you again on the call are aware of edX, so a collaboration between a hip-hop artist and Janine Webber, Holocaust survivor, in sharing that testimony in a really innovative and new way. And we're also working with other organisations and institutions on those innovative approaches. So what we would have been sharing at the moment physically, were it not for coronavirus, is The Eye as Witness. So an exhibition looking at the predominance of perpetrator-taken photography in relation to sharing narratives of the Holocaust and questioning that. And that exhibition actually opens with a VR experience. So again, it's about engaging audiences in different ways. Having said that, all of that work is absolutely rooted in testimony, in our collections, which again, we are so privileged that survivors have shared with us and shared their artifacts with us, and in research. So it's about approaching new audiences and approaching through new methodologies, but very much rooting that in the research and the authenticity and the provenance needed to do that carefully.
Thank you very much, Louise. I mean, it's worth noting you talked about a lot of, we're here talking about, you know, museums, memorials, archives, and so many of the programs that you mentioned are ones that don't actually require people to come to rural Nottinghamshire, where the center is located. So it does really expand our thinking about what the role of a museum might be.
I think you're completely right. Being in a field kind of forced us to think about that question pre-corona. So yeah, we probably had to engage with that a little bit before everybody else. So
Very good. I think Rachel's sound is working now. So Rachel Donnelly from the Imperial War Museums. Do you want to tell us a little bit about, I mean, I suppose the IWM's works specifically relating to the Holocaust? I know there's been a lot going on that front lately, hasn't there?
Yes, thank you, Alex. I hope you can all hear me now. We seem to have resolved our issues with the microphone. First of all, thank you, AJR. Thank you, Ira, for inviting Imperial War Museums to take part in this online discussion. Really excited to be part of it. And for those of you who perhaps don't know, Imperial War Museums was established in 1917 in the midst of the First World War. And essentially we are a global authority on conflict and its impact on people's lives. And central to our aims at the museum is essentially to help people understand why we go to war, and the effects of conflict and war on people's lives, to develop a deeper and richer and more complex understanding of the causes, the course and the consequences of war, and essentially to challenge audiences to consider consider conflict from many different perspectives. In terms of the role and the projects that I'm working on at the moment, as Alex in his introduction referenced, I'm now managing a project partnership, the Second World War and Holocaust Partnership Programme, which is kindly funded by the UK's National Lottery Heritage Fund. And it's a 3-year project. We were set up the project earlier on this year, a couple of months before coronavirus kicked in the UK and the lockdown measures. We were very pleased to be able to meet up with our 8 national partners across the UK that we're working with on this project over the next 3 years. And essentially the project is about enabling our national partners, some of whom are joining us, Louise and Lillian from Huddersfield and from Nottingham, and others, I think Gareth at the Manchester Jewish Museum, essentially helping those organisations, sharing our collections, sharing our expertise, but also acknowledging the expertise that's resident within those organisations, to work with new audiences. So audiences who currently have a low or minimal engagement with IWM and also with our partner organisations, to engage with them to share diverse stories related to the Second World War and Holocaust within the UK. And essentially this project has at its heart collaboration, recognition, as I mentioned, of the expertise that is there within all of our organisations, but also to, as I say, to work with audiences who, for a variety of reasons, aren't engaging culturally with organisations, with commemorative groups, and giving them a voice, a stronger voice, in being able to share those complex, those local stories that tell essentially a national story of Britain's connection to the Second World War and Holocaust in a different way. So lots of digital working, lots of collaborative working with community groups across the UK. And just to your point about generally the museum in terms of its response to coronavirus, yes, we closed on the 18th of March, as many other organisations across the UK, cultural organisations across the UK did. We obviously had a very strong online presence prior to coronavirus, but a lot of our public engagement work now has moved online. So there's lots of engagement with various different audiences in our collections, through film, through photographs, through marking different anniversaries, the VE75, as many of you got involved in that earlier this year. So lots of exciting work happening there digitally.
Very good, thank you. It's worth noting now 2 out of 2 guests on the panel so far have talked about how their institution is prioritizing expanding their audience, and I can't help but wonder what, the extent to which, and we can get into this later, that the need or the desire anyway to expand an audience, how that plays with what it is that we are putting in exhibitions, in learning packs and schemes of work and things like that relating to the Holocaust, and how those two relate. I want to now to bring in Barbara Warnock from the Wiener Holocaust Library and hear a little bit about their work and their programs. Barbara, are you there? Can you?
Yes, I am. So no sound.
No, we hear you.
You hear me? Right, okay.
See you.
For a minute. Okay, good. Hello everyone. I'm really delighted to be here today, and thanks to Alex and the AJR and to Ira. And just to tell you a little bit about the Wiener Holocaust Library, we are usually based in Russell Square, and we're one of the world's oldest archives of material on the Nazi era and the Holocaust. We were originally founded in some senses in Germany. We have some collections going right back to the 1920s in Germany, and we have a lot of material from the 1930s. We came to Britain in 1939 and have been in London ever since, and have continued to gather material about the Holocaust from survivors and from lots of different sources. As well as gathering a lot of material about Jewish refugees who came to Britain in the 1930s and 40s. So just to sort of tell you very briefly about our programmes, we have a reading room where you can view our collections and books on the relevant subjects. We've got an exhibition space, and we have about 3 temporary exhibitions a year on our subjects. We normally have a very busy programme of in-person events, so evening events, talks on the subject, school workshops, university workshops. At the moment, we have an online programme, but obviously it's kind of quite different and much reduced, I think, from the in-person stuff, but we're starting to kind of build that up and develop that. One thing I've been working on in recent months that I'm quite excited about is our next exhibition, that we tentatively are hoping to launch sort of to a few people soon in the library, but obviously this is coronavirus allowing and with social distancing, but this is going to be about Jewish resistance to the Holocaust, and it covers a whole range of things from partisan groups in the Soviet Union to resistance in ghettos and camps, urban resistance networks in Western Europe, and it goes from kind of armed resistance to spiritual resistance and individual resistance, and so it covers a lot of ground. And the Wiener Library has particularly strong collections in the area of urban resistance and kind of resistance networks in places like Brussels and Paris and Berlin. So we've got lots of interesting material there. So I'm really hoping that we can launch that properly soon, but we're going to make a little film about it as well so that we can share it online. And just on that point, to also say that fortunately we had just before lockdown we'd launched our online educational website, The Holocaust Explained, and that's been good because that's a way of us kind of trying to talk to schools and educators, but also we very much put out our collections through that site and use our collections as the documents where possible. So that just gives you a brief indication of some of our work and what we've been trying to carry on doing in lockdown.
Excellent, thank you. It's really noteworthy that, given that this is an event under the auspices of the UK's IRA delegation, that one of the issues that the IRA works on so much is ensuring access to archives around the world. And so many of them, researchers, the main challenge is that they just can't get access to very important archives. And it's noteworthy, as we're here looking at the role of institutions in the UK, that, one of the predominant archives in the world is here in the UK, and it's not, you're quite the opposite of trying to keep people out of your archives. You're doing everything you can to encourage people to come make use of it. An archive is really only as good as people's ability to use it and engage with it, right? Yeah.
Yes, definitely. And no, we're definitely focusing all the time on trying to bring more people in and also make it more accessible online.
Very good. Thank you. And now I want to bring in Martin Winstone, who is part of the team that is working to develop, among other things, the Learning Center component of the new UK Holocaust Memorial, which is meant to be in Victoria Tower Gardens, right next to the House of Parliament, if all goes according to plan. Martin, are you there?
I am, yes. Thank you, Alex.
Excellent. Welcome. Tell us a little bit about what you've been working on.
Sure. First of all, I'd just like to echo everybody else's thanks to the AJR and to you for organising this, and maybe personally also for the book plug, which is always appreciated.
Available in all fine online retailers, I'm sure.
Yeah, indeed. At least one of them. And obviously we're in a slightly unusual situation because I'm representing an institution which doesn't yet physically exist. And so it's hard, hard to say exactly what this institution will end up doing. But I think, fundamentally there will be three core elements to this. First, of course, there is a physical memorial, the memorial designed by Sir David Adjaye and Ron Arad, which in and of itself will be a focus, hopefully, for Holocaust remembrance in this country. But then, as I'm sure most of the audience are aware, the memorial is integrated with what's called a learning centre. And that, I think, will essentially have two aspects to it in a way. First of all is there will be a permanent exhibition, a historical exhibition which is focusing primarily on Britain's relationship with the Holocaust in all of its complexity. And that's frankly what we're primarily working on at the moment. Again, coronavirus has an impact here. Referring back to archives, I have a team of researchers who should be not that far away from Barbara some days in the Wiener Library, looking at the wealth of materials there are there, and in other libraries across the UK, which obviously is something we're not able to do at the moment. But nonetheless, there is a significant amount of archival material which is accessible online, which we're currently trawling through to create this exhibition. And then there will be, in a form to be determined, some sort of more formal educational aspect to the Learning Centre. I think it's important to stress, and you alluded to at the start, the number of organisations there are in the UK, museums, memorials, archives, and the organisations which are formally focused on education, which were represented last week. And I think, for the most part, these organisations all complement each other, and that's certainly the intention here. There is no desire, I think, from any of our institutions to replicate or to replace what anyone else is doing. So, as I say, the exact form that the educational offer in the memorial will take has very much to be determined. But I would just add, one other point, which I think is maybe pertinent to our discussion today, that beyond as it were, the more official learning programs which museums and exhibitions may have, the very act of visiting an exhibition in and of itself is hopefully an educational experience.
I'm on mute. Absolutely. Thanks for that. And actually, while you're there on my screen, I want to start the second question, directing it towards you, and that is about local history. One of the points in these IRA recommendations on teaching and learning about the Holocaust is, whilst of course the Holocaust is essentially a global event, and it can be taught slightly differently in different national contexts as well, there's also a local element that encourages young people to learn about whatever the most local level of history is. And I suppose in countries that were Nazi occupied, there are obvious landmarks, and you've written about quite a few of them, where the Holocaust might be commemorated. Britain doesn't have these, but I'm wondering if you can share your views on what our sites, and in quotation marks, how they can play a role in emphasizing local stories, given that we don't have the obvious historical links.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important point. I mean, I think generally one of the major trends in research into the history of the Holocaust since the millennium across Europe has been focusing on the local. And in one sense, as you allude to, that that's more straightforward in Ukraine than it would appear to be, say, in the UK. But I think one of the things that I hope our institution will be able to do, and I think the other institutions represented here do very well as well, is to make people realise how much this is a part of their history, so a part of their national history, but also their local history. And we're not just talking about the history of governments, of politicians, but we're talking about local communities and families across the UK. By some sort of design, immediately underneath me on the screen here is Lillian Black, and you mentioned the Holocaust exhibition and Learning Centre in Huddersfield, and I think that's a fantastic example of how a locally based institution is able both to educate about the Holocaust in its entirety, but also particularly to its community, to perhaps make that community more aware than it previously was of just how embedded this history is there. So the Huddersfield Institution tells the stories of survivors who ended up in West Yorkshire. particularly, and tells the story of the Holocaust through their experiences. And I think also then within our own country, there are so many sites, mostly hidden sites in terms of public memory, which are a part of this history. And the AJR has obviously been doing a lot to try to commemorate this, particularly with putting up plaques in various places around the UK. But we have so much of this local history, whether it's refugee hostels, schools that refugees ended up in, agricultural training centres, but also maybe slightly more uncomfortable aspects of our local history, like internment camps, which again, I suppose gives you an opportunity to plug what the AJR is currently doing. But this is so much more a part of our history, I think, than people realise. And museums and memorials and archives play a crucial role in making people aware of that. And you know, we sometimes get people asking the question, perhaps particularly when a lot of money is being spent on educating or memorialising the Holocaust, what's it got to do with us? And the Holocaust raises some very fundamental questions, and that in and of itself is to do with us. But I think also we should all realise it is so much a part of our history.
Absolutely. You mentioned Lillian Black, who has also just sent me a message in the chat box here. This lovely. She says, our sites, meaning, you know, in Britain, our sites are our people and their memories. So it's in, you know, in her thinking, it's sort of reconceptualizing maybe not what a site is, but the role, whereas people in other parts of, say, Europe have, you know, physical landmarks that they can point to, and that that sparks a conversation about memory. In Lillian's thinking, you know, what we have is many survivors and their families and the stories that they share. So thank you for sharing that, Lillian. Martin Stern also sends in a comment, just you know, reminding us of the importance of the Channel Islands as part of UK history, which is absolutely correct that he should remind us of that. So thank you, Martin, for that. But speaking of just this question about local histories, I mean, Rachel, this very much ties in with the project that you were describing, doesn't it? I mean, is that one of the goals of that initiative, which is to not just to bring in new audiences from far-flung, you know, regions of the country that don't normally get to go to one of the Imperial War Museums, but to, you know, encourage them to think about what is, you know, the history that is specific to their local town or region.
Yes, very much so. I would wholeheartedly echo Martin's comments, and it's very much a part of our core aims for the Second World War and Holocaust Partnership. So yes, not only bringing in new audiences, but helping organisations, helping our 8 partners, and then the community partners and audiences that they will work with to, yeah, very much connect with those local stories. You know, this is a very, as we know, a very rich and complex and very challenging history. And often those very personal stories, those local stories, are those ways in for audiences who perhaps don't engage with us anyway. So yeah, I mean, I again echo the comment about the reconceptualizing the sense of what we mean by a site, by thinking about those local stories, those local people who have settled in various parts of the UK, survivors who settled in various parts of the UK at the end of the Second World War. One of the projects that also comes to mind, one of our partners is Aberystwyth University and the academic Andrea Hamill, I'm sure who many of you know, who has long worked in the field of researching kinder transport, and I know she's done a lot of work with AJR in the past. And her particular project is focusing on the experience of kinders who arrived at a local castle close to the university, Greenwich Castle, and she'll be focusing her project looking at their experiences. And also then working with, amongst other community groups, but also working with refugees and asylum seekers who are currently settled in and around Aberystwyth, and thinking about relevance and connections to their experiences and their journeys to the UK. And all of our partners, certainly that's their aim, to think about those local connections where that is possible. Some are more obvious than others, and hopefully during the project we hope that some of the stories that are shared, essentially it's enabling people that engage with the project to hear about experiences, to find out about experience that perhaps are outside the dominant narrative that many people are familiar with in the UK in terms of its connection with the Second World War and Holocaust.
Thank you very much. I have a lot of questions, and they're coming in thick and fast as well from our audience as well. So if it's okay with Louise and Barbara, I want to move on to another topic, unless either of you have something burning that you want to say on the topic of local histories. No, okay.
Well, I just maybe have one point, which I don't, no one needs to respond to at all, but it just occurs to me that whilst there's lots of positives about local history, it sometimes, you know, research kind of, for example, UCL research can indicate that in Britain there's a massive lack of understanding about how the Holocaust really unfolded and say its effects in Far Eastern Europe. And so local history and individual histories are good, but also, you know, it shouldn't sort of detract from the fact that it's really crucially important for people to actually understand the event in its kind of international context. And sometimes the British approach might seem a little bit parochial or something like that. I mean, it's not either or, but just to raise that point.
Absolutely. I've always thought, I mean, you know, Martin and I have worked together for many years on projects that included taking students and teachers on overseas study visits. And the idea being that, you know, there is something, you know, particularly special about going to Holocaust sites or sites associated with it, you know, the Nazi era, you know, in Germany, Poland, Lithuania, Hungary, you name it. And, you know, I do wonder if in a post-coronavirus world, when maybe those sorts of trips are going to be less likely, the question is, well, what's not necessarily a like-for-like replacement for those sorts of experiences, but what are other ways of engaging with young people? I mean, certainly visiting sites like the Holocaust Center, the Imperial War Museums, you know, any of the other institutions that I referenced earlier are possibilities, but also so too could be, you know, helping them to understand that there was a, you know, a hostel where Kindertransport refugees stayed just a few miles down the road, or something along those lines, which would be quite an interesting sort of, you know, area of potential for the future of teaching and learning about the Holocaust, I think. I want to talk about what all this sort of says about the UK, about Britain. In that IRA publication on teaching and learning about the Holocaust, it's divided into sections: why teach about the Holocaust, what to teach about the Holocaust, and how to teach about the Holocaust. And it's very good in sort of breaking down the pedagogy. There's this one point that I thought was very interesting in there. It's under the how section. It says, collective memory is how a group of people remember a historical experience, often reflecting that society's values, and pass that memory from one generation to the next. A collective memory is embodied, for example, in public remembrance days, museums and memorials, and other kinds of established national narratives. Enable learners, this is the guidance that they give, enable learners to examine the ways in which they are part of a collective memory through public institutions and social bonds such as schools, media, and family. So I'm curious to know, to what extent do your institutions kind of acknowledge that role that they play in forming this wider collective memory, and does that filter its way into the actual learning programs? Louise, is that something that factors into your work in developing educational programs at the National Holocaust Center and Museum?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in a way, to kind of transition back to the last question, I think one of the things that we're really conscious of as students come on site to the centre, like Martin was saying, you know, one of our starting points with them is to say, you know, why have you come here? Why come to Nottinghamshire to learn about the Holocaust? You know that the events didn't take place here. And that starting point actually is memory, because I'm asking them that question as they are stood in the Gardens of Memorial and Hope, surrounded by 1,000 roses planted in memorial. So I think that poses the question of memory in a really visceral way for students. And then in terms of the way that we look at the learning programmes, I think we're really aware of that responsibility that we hold in shaping that collective memory. And that comes from the privilege of the testimonies and the artifacts, obviously, that have been shared with us. And I think that part of that responsibility is about supporting the accuracy and reflecting the complexity of sharing that narrative and shaping that collective memory. So, for example, when we're working with students in the Journey exhibition, and there's very often that misconception, that kind of pre-understanding of some kind of redemptive narrative in reflection of the history of the kinder transport, and starting to unpick that with students and with teachers. And I think we've got a second responsibility in the widening of that collective memory. And obviously Rachel was speaking about trying to engage with audiences for whom this consideration or study of this history is something that is not engaged with. And I think that we have to look at how we start to raise that question and how we challenge that with new audiences. I thought it was really interesting in the discussion last week. I think it was Ruth Ann who was saying that it's not about, and it's made clear in the guidelines, that it's not about stating which lessons should be learned through the Holocaust with respect to those contemporary questions. And I think it's really critical that what we are providing as institutions, particularly as museums, is we're providing those reflective spaces. And again, it talks about that in the guidelines, the safe, trusting environment for students to start to engage with those questions. And I think that's a really key area of our responsibility and how we draw others into that discussion. And I think obviously at the moment that is more pertinent than ever as we're looking at the rise of anti-Semitism and the rise of the far right. We've got to really pose those challenges in respect to collective memory to a broader audience. So the football film that we created for Holocaust Memorial Day this year was, again, very deliberately looking at that question of collective memory and how that question is posed for an audience who otherwise might not have considered that for Holocaust Memorial Day that year. So I think it is critical.
Very good. Rachel, your institution, the Imperial War Museums, is, probably, well, I don't know, it's not a contest, but I feel like, it's been around for a very long time and has probably contributed to some sense of, contributed to Britain's collective memory about the Holocaust, since that's what we're here talking about today, maybe more than anything else. I'm aware of the fact that the new sort of exhibition that's being developed, and maybe to some extent the educational programs around it, very much link together the Second World War and the Holocaust in a way that hasn't always been done either at the IWM or most other institutions, where it's sort of either about the Second World War or it's about the Holocaust, but rarely sort of tying them very directly together. Can you tell us about the, going back to this question about collective memory, what's the thinking there?
Yeah, in terms of, you're absolutely right that that previously IWM perhaps didn't make as explicit those connections between Second World War and Holocaust. I think certainly we were very aware of the research that UCL and other organisations had carried out in terms of public understanding, students' understanding around the connections between Second World War and Holocaust, and that there was that separation in terms of people's understanding, that sort of reference to a free-floating Holocaust somehow separated and detached from the Second World War. So it was very much part of our thinking when I was part of the team that's continuing the work to develop the galleries, and how we would bring those two histories together in people's minds physically, and also in terms of the development of the exhibition itself and our learning programs. So to speak about the two new galleries that are opening, for perhaps those people who may not be aware, the two galleries, Second World War and Holocaust galleries, will be opening together in the autumn of next year, and they are physically connected, as well as intellectually connected. So the two teams that have been working on developing the galleries have been working very closely. It's one team essentially, and thinking about the nuances in terms of how we write captions, how we develop that understanding that the Holocaust fits inside the collective event of the overall event of the Second World War, but then also has its own distinct history. So we did a lot of focus group discussions, a lot of consultation with a variety of audiences who currently engage with us, but also we were very keen to, and I'm glad we were able to do it, to speak to individuals or potential audiences, people who don't currently engage with us. And so we did a lot of recruitment around that to bring those people into the museum to help us get a sense of where those preconceptions or misunderstandings are. And I think to your point about collective memory, yes, clearly, the museum has played a very strong role in shaping and reflecting, I would say, collective memory within the UK around the Holocaust. In the current exhibition, as people may know, to give you an example, the very design of it reflected considerations of the late 1990s and how to approach exhibitions. We did a lot of work with our colleagues in Israel and in USHMM in Washington at the time. And also, I would say the focus on Auschwitz, which was very much part of the British consciousness and public memory at that time, and that we were reflecting that, but also perhaps playing a role in shaping that continuing focus perhaps on Auschwitz, maybe to the detriment of other camps and other experiences. So that's something that we did want to bring through in our consideration for the new galleries, that while of course Auschwitz is incredibly important in the history of the Holocaust, and that we also wanted to bring audiences and visitors to the galleries with us in terms of exploring other types of experiences, other types of camps, and also the longer history of Auschwitz itself and its different iterations through time. So to give you one example there.
It's a point we touched on last week in our discussion that I suppose it bears repeating in this context as well, that, whatever the current thinking is in terms of how we educate about or commemorate the Holocaust doesn't have to always remain the same throughout the generations. The IWM's, exhibition, served a very good function for many years. And then, people's in their wisdom and expertise thought, we could explain this story a bit better, a bit differently. And then sort of write a different narrative, which isn't because, we suddenly are changing our story or anything like that. It's just because our understanding of how to explain these things evolves over time. And that's a good thing. I think that's very important. It's the same with educational programs as well. The understanding of what best practices isn't the same as it was 20 years ago.
Absolutely. And just to briefly follow up on that point, I know that I want to allow others to speak. In terms of our education program, that very much echo Louise's comments, that we would very much, in our conversations with students, ask them to think about why come to IWM, why come here, and then begin a discussion about why that has happened and focus on our collections, and also very much to encourage young people to remember that based on evidence, based on wonderful expertise and lots of consultation, IWM's interpretation is but one, and other museums and organisations will draw upon other pieces of evidence, other personal stories, and develop different interpretations. So very much about thinking about the process of history and the process of memory is something that's very important in our education programs.
Thank you. Just want to read a few questions and comments here. So Barbara Winton, who's joining us today. Hello, Barbara, who has done amazing work to promote the legacy of her father, Sir Nicholas Winton, and has done great work on behalf of contemporary refugees today. She writes, "My experience is that most of what we learn about the Holocaust creates identification with the victims and rescuers. Is there, in these polarized times, some value in talking more about how people become perpetrators?" Actually, Barbara, I wonder if, given the origins of the Wiener Holocaust Library were in documenting Nazism as it was unfolding, what are your views on educating about how people become perpetrators?
Yeah, I think it's really crucial, and it probably is something that is often overlooked, because understandably there is a focus on the experience of victims and also the responses of victims, which is, you know, really important. But I think that both for historical reasons and perhaps for the relevance it might have in terms of reflecting on current day politics, it's important to think about, you know, perpetrators, both in terms of a kind of wider, maybe a wider view about how a society or even a continent might become, might perpetrate such a thing, and also looking at the individual focus as well, because that can be illuminating as well and point to the bigger picture. So no, absolutely, I think for historical reasons and for the relevance today, it's really important.
Thank you. I wanted, because this is, you know, the title of this three-part symposium is about teaching and learning about the Holocaust. I want to talk about a little bit about the formal education sector. I mean, you know, museums and memorials and archives can also have a important function in informal education or lifelong learning. But I know we have a lot of educators here at this event. And one of the things that it says in the new IRA recommendations, it says educators in formal settings such as schools and informal settings such as museums and other entities can engage learners through responsible, fact-based historical approaches informed by other disciplines. Although unique in time and place, the Holocaust was nonetheless a human event that raises challenging questions about individual and collective responsibility, the meaning of active citizenship, and about structures and societal norms that can become dangerous for certain groups and society as a whole. So Martin, come back to you. I mean, you're starting with a blank canvas. And are you conscious of trying to tick all of those sorts of boxes?
I think, I mean, to an extent, I mean, one can't tick every box. And I think in a way that relates to a point Louise made in reference to the last question. The sense of responsibility. I think with everything that we try to do, I'm sure across all of our organizations, we know that whatever programs we create or whatever content we include in an exhibition, we are making choices. We're making choices to include, but that also means inevitably, because of the massive historical and human content there is to the Holocaust, to exclude as well. So I think you know, there is that real sense of being mindful of trying to not necessarily to tick boxes, but to take a responsible approach to what one is doing. And I think that's particularly acute in the museum sector, because in a way, formal education to a greater or lesser extent has a degree of regulation in not all countries, but most countries. Whereas obviously museums to a considerable extent devise their own educational programs. And these are for many members of the public, particularly people whose formal education maybe ended some time ago, this is one of their major means of learning about this history. So what we do with that, how we approach it, I think is a really important consideration. And you know, there are certain core principles I think we would all want to follow, but at the same time there is some acknowledgement that there are going to be differences within that, both in terms of the content that's included and also the means of communication of it.
It's I should have mentioned this in your introduction, that Martin is also a member of the UK delegation to the IRA, and so Martin, as you know, one of the things that we often find ourselves discussing, and with colleagues from other IRA countries, are things that we deem to be problematic in other countries where there seems to be sort of government interference, or in museums and memorials, in what they do and don't include, as you point out, that seems to be presenting a rather skewed or biased narrative about a particular country's history. I'm very consciously avoiding mentioning things right now for fear of getting myself into trouble. But then, there is this question of, well, is the project that you're working on in the UK, does it run the same risk, of whitewashing or just presenting certain narratives? There was a comment here from Ruth Deitch, who I'm looking to find it, but she talks about how one of the most significant elements of the UK's involvement in the Holocaust for her was is that as a mandate power, it closed the door to Palestine for the 1930s, and had more Jews been able to go there, far fewer would have been murdered, presumably. These are the messy details of history that, you know, you could imagine some governments would want to not include in, you know, their national learning center. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, and it is a real challenge, and you're perfectly right. I think not to name any of the particularly problematic museums there may be at the moment. I think it's always been there ever since the Holocaust, how we choose to remember it, and it goes back to that point about collective memory, that it's, you know, it's not monolithic, it's not static, but it is ultimately based on obviously a range of different factors, but ultimately people are making choices. They're making choices about what they commemorate, and this is, you know, obviously has a resonance beyond the Holocaust, particularly in our current climate, and where they commemorate it and how they commemorate it. And certainly the principle that we as members of the IRA delegation very much strive for is to ensure that history in all of its messiness, all of its nuance is addressed. And that can be uncomfortable for some people. All I can say in the course of the development of the memorial is that, you know, we have as our co-chairs, as many people know, Lord Pickles and Ed Balls. Lord Pickles is also the head of our IRA delegation, and he particularly, I think, all the way through, both within IRA and in the development of the memorial, has been very keen to ensure that it does take this warts and all approach to our history, not to condemn, not to celebrate, but to present the history insofar as we're able to as it was. And that absolutely, I mean, Baroness Teach is absolutely right. That also includes not just the history of Britain, these islands in the Holocaust, but also Britain as an imperial power, as the mandatory power in Palestine, inevitably means Palestine. And equally also it raises questions about immigration policy to Britain in the 1930s, and not just in the 1930s, but as, you know, an issue for many of your members, post-war as well. What happened to those refugees? What happened to the survivors who came over after the war?
Louise, you know, I'm conscious of time, so maybe just briefly, you know, your institution doesn't have a blank canvas. You know, the exhibition's been around for a while. I think, you know, last time I went there, I thought it was still served its purpose very well, but you're sort of developing new content in other ways. You talked about rap videos and virtual reality and apps and things like that. And, you know, just touching, you know, this isn't exactly a compare and contrast kind of question, but, you know, touching on Martin's point about, you know, the messiness of history and what gets included, you know, in doing these sort of more technologically innovative things, you know, do you have to make these same sorts of tough historical decisions about narratives and content?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that it probably relies to do this well, to combine the innovative and the audience focused approach, and maintain the awareness and the sharing of the messiness and the nuance. I think it relies probably on two really important supporting factors. The first is the element of research that goes into the creation of any of those resources. So, for example, when I was talking about the launch of the Journey app, that's taken 3 years and an exhaustive amount of research to go into the creation of those virtual environments and the narrative and the characterization. So I think it's partly about what is inputted into that process. And then I think critically for us, particularly as our primary audience are students and schools, it's about the supporting materials that we give to students and particularly to teachers, actually then in the sharing of those resources. So again, to use the Journey app as an example, that is a 60 to 90 minute learning experience. We have got 2 schemes of work that support that are extremely detailed, that take teachers through the historical contextualization, that refer to our artifacts, that share excerpts of testimony. So it's very much about having a creative stimulus and a way of engaging with students in methods that they recognise and feel relevant and feel valuable to them, but ensuring that that is always shared in a context that enables teachers to deal effectively with, like you say, those key historical nuanced questions that they need to share and they need to discuss with students. And I think, again, the guidelines are so helpful in for educators ensuring that that sits within the right parameters and then supporting teachers as they deliver that in the classroom.
Very good. Now, I got one message here that says that we shouldn't end the discussion here. Does anyone have any place they need to be? Can we go on for a few minutes longer? If any of our audience were only planning on a 1 hour event and you need to log off, no one will know. So that's obviously we understand. But just to, I feel like we're just getting started here. Not that, you know, we'll go on for another hour, but maybe a little while longer. I wanted to touch on this point. Someone asked a question that relates to something we said earlier about, yes, here it is. Fran Horich, our colleague in Manchester, says Holocaust education needs to reach adults also. Are museums consciously planning for this? And I think by museums, she means all of the institutions represented here. I'm wondering, you know, obviously, Barbara, you know, the Wiener Library is primarily, I suppose, in terms of its visitors, the researchers. Are there, you mentioned your exhibition space. I mean, are there other ways that you see yourself as a center that engages with people in the lifelong learning capacity?
Yeah, well, we do through our events as well. So yeah, obviously people can come and do research themselves, or they can, we offer kind of a family research service as well through the International Tracing Service. But also we do have a lot of events in normal circumstances in the evening exploring issues. And we also, you know, offer other things. So for example, in recent years, I've given quite a lot of talks to the University of the Third Age. We tend to, different branches come in and I'll talk about either a theme that they want me to talk about or the latest exhibition, which, you know, are on a diversity of topics. And sometimes I'm invited out to libraries and so on. I think our main constraint is just that we're a really small organisation. So we don't have a large staff. And so it's quite difficult to kind of massively expand that programme. But yes, we are consciously thinking of that. And we're hoping to have a adult education programme, kind of maybe a more formal one at some point soon. In the past, I have thought that hasn't really come to fruition of working with the Workers' Education Association. So it is something that we kind of think of consistently, because I fully agree. I think there's a lot of focus in Holocaust education on children, and that is obviously really important. But it is also important to make sure that Holocaust education that adults receive, you know, is kind of accurate and also reflective of latest research, latest pedagogy and everything like that as well.
Very good. And Rachel, I mean, obviously, when you talked earlier about the Second World War and Holocaust Partnership Program, you know, the whole idea is expanding the audience. So I'm assuming that adult, you know, learners engaging with the programs is a key part of that. I'm wondering, you know, given the topic that we talked about last week, which is the sort of the challenges and sometimes what some people perceive as the deficiencies with Holocaust education in the formal education sector, which normally I think comes down to lack of time and maybe lack of, you know, professional development, you know, for teachers. But is it the case that maybe, you know, institutions like the IWM should say, yes, we know what the limitations of Holocaust education are in the classroom, but that doesn't have to be the end of anyone's learning about the Holocaust. No one says that the sum total of what a person ever learns about the Holocaust has to be in their year 9 history class, nor does it have to be in school at all. And then that's sort of where you take over from there and just, you know, carry on the process for learners of all ages.
Yes, absolutely. To pick up the first part of your question, absolutely. The Second World War and Holocaust Partnership Programme is not a schools programme. It's aimed very much at adult audiences. and University of the Third Age, if you like, and community organisations. And yeah, I think we're very much aware that in the work that we do in the museums, yes, obviously, while there's a key focus on young people, that of course many visitors that come to the museum, or people that don't engage with us, have perhaps had maybe not a very good experience in terms of their engagement with learning about the Holocaust, but for a variety of reasons, that perhaps they've switched off in their later lives. So we're at a really exciting moment, I would say, in terms of the development of new approaches and new directions in terms of Holocaust learning, thinking about it holistically at the museum, because of course we will have a schools learning programme that will develop around the opening of the new galleries next year. But certainly my colleagues in the public engagement and learning programme at the museum are thinking very carefully and are spending time thinking about the ways in which we can engage with wider, broader audiences. And Louise mentioned it earlier, ways that are relevant to them, and methods and methodologies and ways of working with non-school audiences that are relevant to asking different kinds of questions, posing different sorts of challenges. And very much the museum, as all museums I believe should be, being those safe spaces for debate, places where people can ask those questions that they find it really complicated, they don't quite know how to formulate the question, but that we as a museum create a space that's safe, that's comfortable for people to feel confident to ask those questions, and that we can bring in experts from other organisations and say that yes, we have this area of knowledge and understanding, but we really want to collaborate and work with other partners, with other organisations to present a more holistic approach to Holocaust learning.
Thank you for that. Some interesting comments here. Anthony Lishak says, regarding reaching of adults, Fran's point from a moment ago, it's often useful to use school-based work to engage parents in the wider school community through formal sharing of the work of students, which is a very good point. And then Jerry Dillon, writing in from Scotland, says the Anne Frank Trust have inverted this learning by teaching the pupils to teach their peers and staff, and then they go out into the community to teach them. So lots of, and the Anne Frank Trust, not a museum, but they do have a traveling exhibition. So, I think they maybe, enter into the conversation as well in terms of just how we can use those types of exhibitions as a springboard for all sorts of innovative learning programs. Just scanning here to see other interesting comments. There's a lot of them. Sorry, I'm not getting to everyone's comments here. There's some very, very interesting and some provocative ones that I think would require their own weekly discussion panel here. So thank you. Just wondering to our panelists, are there any questions that you wish I had asked that I haven't, or any burning points that you wanted to raise? Is there anyone who wanted to say anything else on the topic of the role of Britain's museums, memorials, and archives? What does it say about this country, the breadth of them, the sheer number of them, and just the work that they're doing? Any concluding points or anything else that you wanted to add?
Well, I just say, actually, Alex, the last time you asked that question, are there any questions that you wished I'd asked, was actually in a job interview many years ago. But I think it is a fascinating thing. I mean, for a country which actually even 30 years ago didn't have this wealth of institutions. I mean, we had the Wiener Library, we had the Imperial War Museum, which had an exhibition about the liberation of Belsen. And I think it tells us something. I'm not sure exactly what it tells us, but it tells us something about our society and our relationship with the Holocaust, that since that time, we now have this plethora of institutions, the institutions represented here today, others that you mentioned at the start. And I think that can only be a good thing, because again, it comes back to this point, I think, that there is no one approach which is correct for every audience for addressing this history. And in relation actually to the last question, I think a key issue is not just about how we educate about adults, but when we educate children, what's the right age? Which is obviously an age which schools have to consider, but even more so to some extent, I think museums. So, you know, Louise is at an institution where they very much have something directly targeted at primary schools. Some of the other history of other institutions would not be appropriate for students of that age, and then it's recommended they're not. And so it's about finding a range of different approaches which collectively enrich people's understanding of this history. And lead them to want to learn more. I think that's always the thing that we're aiming to do.
Right. Louise, I see you've politely.
Yeah, just to kind of support what Martin was saying really there, just in terms of that richness and the diversity of approaches, I think particularly where we are at the moment, and like you indicated at the beginning, Alex, that we are so far away from, you know, ordinary practice, then I think what it just emphasises again is just that necessity of working together and collaboration. And I know it's something that you keep kind of leading us to that is so important. And I was in the HMDT partnership meeting yesterday, and Lillian said exactly the same thing, that we've all got our area of expertise, we've got audiences that we can engage with really well. This is absolutely the time that we need to be really talking to each other and learning from each other, I think.
Amen to that. Absolutely. Yeah, someone did ask a question about, you know, or is there a danger of overlap between some of these institutions? And I think you've said it beautifully. I mean, you know, there's far more scope for working together than there is any sort of overlap. Rachel, I see you've got your hand.
Yeah, just to make a final comment in terms of, certainly that was one of the key aims of establishing the Second World War and the Holocaust Partnership Programme with our 8 partners. I wish it could have been more across the UK. And I think also perhaps an interesting point to consider is that looking even further forward, we've rightly mentioned perhaps where the field was 20 years ago and the number of organisations and the range of organisations and how far we've moved in the past 20 years. I think also it could be quite interesting, and I don't necessarily have the answer, but in another 20 or 40 years, when we come closer to the centenary of the Second World War, where Holocaust education in this country will be. I think it may not necessarily be all of us around the table talking about it, you never know, but I think it might be interesting to think about where we are there, where perhaps there has been more aligning between organisations, or whether there will be ever more specific organisations focusing on specific areas of this history. I think it'd be interesting to think about that as we go forward.
Brilliant, thank you. Barbara, final word from you.
Yeah, just to kind of say, agree with what everyone was saying, and I think in terms of different approaches, yeah, there is quite a lot of variety, but a lot of cooperation, and the different approaches can sometimes just stem from different types of institutions. So, you know, we've got a specific collection that leads us often in certain directions, and we very much try and focus on being led by the collections and the documents and the evidence that we have, and that's partly because of our history and the kind of institution we are.
Brilliant. Well, thank you to all of our panelists for these fantastic contributions. I think this has been a very fascinating, thought-provoking conversation. I hope our audience has as well. Someone did ask a question about whether I could post a link to the IRA resource and various other resources. The answer is yes. I will send out an email to everyone who signed up through Eventbrite. You'll get a follow-up email with all the links to the institutions represented here and the IRA recommendations and all sorts of other things. So absolutely to that. So thank you to all who joined us, those who stuck with us for a little bit of extra time. Fortunately, we didn't have to go to penalty kicks. And we do have one more of our 3-part symposium on teaching and learning about the Holocaust in the UK next week, when we will look at the role of the IRA, specifically international expertise, and how that affects the work of colleagues here in the UK in terms of education, research, and remembrance. So if you haven't already signed up for that one, please go to Eventbrite to do that. We have not yet hit our maximum 300 people on Zoom yet, so let's see if maybe we can do that next week. On that note, thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you online, and hopefully not too long before I will see you in person soon. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Alex.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Um,